Okay, welcome back. We are going to spend the next two class periods discussing an article that appeared in Adventist Today, not the most conservative magazine that is published by Seventh-day Adventists. We're going to discuss an article that was put on the blog, and the title of this article is Ellen G. White and Her English Composition Skills, a brief summary by Edward C. Hanganu. I hope that I'm pronouncing the name correctly. It was put there on January 23, 2015. And here is a note of explanation that is there on the website of Adventist Today. This is a guest blog on a subject of interest to many Adventists. Edward Hanganu is currently an adjunct English language lecturer in the Department of English at the University of Evansville, Indiana. And it was posted on the Adventist Today website. I'm going to follow this material quite closely. We're going to read the entire article, and then I am going to make some remarks concerning what the article says. So I will read it uncritically first, and then we will offer some, what I believe to be constructive criticism and some answers to the article. The traditional Seventh-day Adventist folkloric and theological literature has often pointed to Ellen White's beautiful prose as the indisputable evidence that the numerous books, articles, pamphlets, and other works for which she took credit and which were published under her name have a non-human but rather celestial or divine origin, because the claimed unique and wonderful English language that defines her religious literature was handed to her through superhuman visions and angelic dictations. So you begin to see in the first paragraph that this is not going to be an objective evaluation of Ellen White. Some readers, though, are not too impressed with the language in her publications and mention that the sentences, paragraphs, and chapters seem to be written in a bombastic rhetoric that appears to be designed to impress, dazzle, and distract rather than inform and convince. The writer seems to wish to impose a certain perspective on her readers, the unverifiable notion that some rhetorical format in a text would prove in itself and without doubt what or who originated the document. Those who have searched deeper, of course like himself, into the writer's background are also faced with a puzzle that seems hard to solve. How could a woman with a limited or rather absent formal education publish books, articles, pamphlets, and other materials that appear to demonstrate above average English composition skills, a large lexicon, and also remarkable grammatical correctness? While it is true that Ellen White made numerous non-factual and uncorroborated claims about her visions, and that angelic guard that often dictated to her divine content. Let me go back again. While it is true that Ellen White made numerous non-factual and uncorroborated claims about her visions, and that angelic guard that often dictated to her divine content, such fantastic claims still fail to explain how her illiterate and illegible longhand scribbles became the beautiful prose that continues to amaze and awe the Seventh-day Adventist church members and persuade them to believe that the books and articles she published under her name are God-given and contained unadulterated and perfect truths. This brief discussion is intended to summarize Ellen White's English language skills from the information contained in her own autobiographical and personal comments, which she made at different times in her life, and from information contained in the biographical book that her grandson, Arthur L. White, wrote, and offers some possible explanation for the radical and implausible distance between Ellen White's non-existent language skills and the well-written documents that were published under her name and for which she took credit. Then comes the subtitle, Ellen White's English Skills Summarized. When she lived with her parents in Portland, Maine, Ellen White had an accident that produced a radical change in her life. She was 9 at the time, and a classmate hit her on the nose with a stone. Due to the adverse health state that followed the trauma, Ellen's formal education ended abruptly. She was able to attend school but little, and it seemed impossible for her to study and to retain what she learned. She was so weak that her hand trembled so that she made but little progress in writing. And she could get no farther than the simple copies in coarse hand. Because she was so debilitated, her teachers recommended that she leave school for a time until she regained her health. She never returned to formal education, and evidence shows that her English language skills never developed enough to be adequate for book and article publication. That's one of the points that I'm going to definitely argue with. She was 45 when she complained that she was not a scholar, that she could not prepare her own writings for the press, and that she wished to become a scholar in the grammar science. Her inadequate skills made it imperative that she have help from her husband and others at all times. The prophet, you notice he puts it in quotation marks, the prophet even became so discouraged and disappointed with her poor editorial skills that she made the decision that, and now he quotes, "Therefore I shall do no more with them," that is with her documents, "at present. I am not a scholar. I cannot prepare my own writings for the press. Until I can do this, I shall write no more." Arthur White mentions that, and here's a quotation, "It was ever a source of regret to Mrs. White that her schooling had been very brief, and her knowledge of the technical rules of writing was therefore limited. When she started to publish, she asked James White to help her," and now this is a quotation, "help her in preparing it," that is the work, "technically for publication. And he," once again a quote, "would point out weaknesses in composition and faulty grammar." Ellen White emphasizes the fact that her husband corrected her grammatical errors and eliminated needless repetition from her sentences and paragraphs. When James White, and he's offering several quotations here, I won't mention every time that you have quotation marks, when James White could not give time to the technical correction of all of her writings, Ellen White was forced to resort to editorial assistance for the same work, that is, the burden of making grammatical corrections. That extensive editorial work was needed because often her sentences and paragraphs were not grammatically consistent and were often plagued with faulty arrangement, and unnecessary repetition. This happened because she paid little attention to the rules of punctuation, capitalization, and spelling, and there was much repetition and faulty grammatical construction in her paragraphs. Historian Ronald Graybill summarizes in the following manner the illiterate condition that characterized Ellen White's English language composition skills and defined her handwritten manuscripts before the editorial assistants changed those scribbles into the beautiful prose for which Ellen White took unfair credit. With effort, Mrs. White could write neatly and compose clear sentences. Early in her career, most of her letters went out in her own hand. But with editors to rely on, she devoted less and less attention to style, grammar, and penmanship. These are the words of Graybill. She usually wrote in great haste and deep conviction. The result was a torrent of thoughts, uninhibited by the conventions of complete sentences and compact paragraphs. Robert Peel said of Mrs. Eddy, now for some reason he's going to transition to Mary Baker Eddy and compare her to Ellen White. Once again, Robert Peel said of Mrs. Eddy that some of the writing seems to be a rush and tumble of words, as though the writer's thoughts were flooding ahead of her pen. Sentences are chaotic, punctuation erratic, quotations inexact, meanings obscure. He's referring here to Mary Baker Eddy, insinuating that Ellen White is in the same category. In fact, he says the words might be applied to Ellen White as well. Then he discusses Ellen White's editorial helpers. Because Ellen White's composition skills were so minimal and inadequate, she had to depend on what she liked to call helpers, secretaries, or editorial assistants, who were hired to correct and edit her sometimes plagiarized pages, paragraphs, and chapters, compile that plagiarized material into books, articles, and pamphlets, and prepare the documents for the press. Being quite objective, isn't he? Jerry Moon, Church History Department Chair at Andrews University, mentions the rather unknown and curious fact. Folks, it is not unknown and curious. It is well known. But anyway, he mentions the rather unknown and curious fact that during her lifetime, Ellen White employed some 20 paid and unpaid individuals to help her in preparation of her letters and manuscripts for mailing or publication. While at any given time, Ellen White would have between 6 and 12 employees working in her publishing enterprise. Those are comments by Jerry Moon. Moon's document includes ample information about all these known and little known helpers, secretaries, or editorial assistants. The information he provides includes their names, work times, clearance, that is how much freedom these individuals had to edit and improve Ellen White's manuscripts or autographs, and their specific work descriptions, or what their particular assignments were. Then he makes additional comments about Ellen White's editorial assistants. Moon lists in this category the following assistants: James White, Mary Clow, Mary Kelsey White, James Edson White, W.C. White, Marion Davis, Adelia Patton, Miss E.G. Burnham, Miss Sarah Peck, Miss Maggie Hare, Mr. Doris E. Robinson, Miss Minnie Hawkins, Sister Tenney, Miss Frances E. Bolton, Mrs. W.F. Caldwell, and Charles C. Chrysler. Out of these individuals, James White, Mary Kelsey White, James Edson White, W.C. White, Marion Davis, and Miss Frances E. Bolton had unlimited clearance. That is, they could plagiarize documents, those are his words, perform heavy editing, those are his words, and prepare documents for publication. The other people Moon mentions had limited editorial clearance. Their work appears to be confined to copying, whatever that means, and other similar basic activities. Moon also mentions a group of consultants, that is, individuals who were requested from time to time to provide her with advice concerning the material she intended to publish, or perform research for her books and other materials. So she had research assistants, in other words. Among them are J.H. Wagoner, J.N. Loughborough, H. Camden Lacey, Edwin R. Palmer, J.H. Kellogg, and he puts in parentheses the pantheist, insinuating that perhaps he might have had some influence on the prophet, and Dr. David Paulson, who are mentioned for consulting, and W.W. Prescott, who is mentioned for research. And now we come to the conclusion of his article. The evidence from Ellen White herself and from her grandson, Arthur L. White, about her absent formal education and her impaired English language skills during her entire lifetime, entire lifetime? He continues saying, demonstrates that Ellen White did not have the English composition and grammar knowledge required to organize her possible ideas, her what? Possible ideas, into fluent, coherent, and literate sentences, paragraphs, and chapters, and to prepare her notes and manuscripts for publication. Given the ample information about the numerous and qualified editorial assistants who were used to work on her manuscripts all through her career as a writer, the most reasonable solution to the puzzle, and the best explanation as to how an illiterate woman could produce literate, even beautiful text that populates the numerous books, articles, and letters for which she took credit, seems to be that it was not Ellen White who wrote these documents and prepared them for the press, but the qualified editorial assistants who worked for her in the publication business but never received the due credit for their work. What do you think? Wow, what an article. People who are not versed will read this and immediately outright they'll say, we don't want anything to do with that plagiarist whose books were written by all of her editorial assistants. But now we want to take a look at this. And I'm going to begin on page 7 where it says, my remarks concerning the article. Let's just skip that top paragraph for the moment. It is obvious that the writer is being far from objective. He accuses Ellen White of using bombastic language, but provides no examples. The author claims that Ellen White uses bombastic language designed to impress, dazzle, and distract rather than inform and convince, and that the writer seeks to impose a certain perspective on the readers. Really? I have read thousands of pages and have never gotten that impression. I guess it all depends with what attitude you read her writings. What is the meaning of the word bombastic? It means high-sounding, but with little meaning, inflated. Now read this paragraph by the author of the article and tell me if the author of this article is not guilty of what he accuses Ellen White. If this is not bombastic language. The traditional Seventh-day Adventist folkloric and theological literature has often pointed to Ellen White's beautiful prose as the indisputable evidence that the numerous books, articles, pamphlets, and other works for which she took credit and which were published under her name have a non-human, but rather celestial or divine origin, because she claimed unique and wonderful English language that defines her religious literature that was handed to her through superhuman visions and angelic dictations. That is bombastic. That which he accuses Ellen White of using is exactly what he is using. And he provides no examples of Ellen White's so-called bombastic language where she seeks to impose on the readers her point of view. Now let's talk about Ellen White's scribbling, as he calls it. I would like to see how the author of the article would scribble after 2.5 years of elementary education, after suffering a life-threatening blow to the face, after having several small strokes and a major stroke, and after suffering with rheumatoid arthritis. It is clear that the author clearly suffers from intellectual pride that borders on arrogance. He leaves a distinct impression that only people with a formal education can write. But there have been many autodidacts, that is, self-taught, that have become quite proficient writers. Ellen White never claimed that her use of beautiful language was proof of her inspiration. She never claimed that her language was handed down to her through superhuman visions and angelic dictations. She never claimed that the message she received was verbally dictated to her. She clearly explains in her writings that prophets were not God's stenographers who took down dictation word for word. She never claimed that every word, every syllable, every idiom, every figure of speech came directly from God. And of course, the author of the article is not claiming that either. What he's saying is that the style of the language of Ellen White comes from her many editors and editorial assistants. But I felt that I needed to make this very clear. On June 4, 1906, Ellen White wrote a letter to a church member who was misinformed about the nature of inspiration. Here are the words. But now, I must respond to the letters received from you and others. In your letter, you speak of your early training to have implicit faith in the testimonies and say, I was led to conclude and most firmly believe that every word that you ever spoke in public or private, that every letter you wrote under any and all circumstances was as inspired as the Ten Commandments. My brother, you have studied my writings diligently. By the way, the Ten Commandments were dictated by God. My brother, you have studied my writings diligently, and you have never found that I have made any such claims. Neither will you find that the pioneers in our cause ever made any such claims. D.M. Canwright, who was a Seventh-day Adventist evangelist, who 3 times forsook the Seventh-day Adventist Church and the 3rd time left for good, became very critical of Ellen White. He actually wrote a book that was published in 1911, The Life of Mrs. E.G. White, and he launched this false accusation at her. Every line she wrote, whether in articles, letters, testimonies, or books, she claimed was dictated to her by the Holy Ghost and hence must be infallible. But Ellen White affirmed, in Selected Messages, Volume 1, page 37, in regard to infallibility, I never claimed it. God alone is infallible. Now, where I'm going with this, folks, is that the way that God inspired the prophets was that God gave the prophet thoughts. He showed the prophet scenes. And then God told the prophet, I want you to write this according to your language skills, according to your ability. So it is not the words that are inspired, it is the prophet that is inspired. So if Ellen White was deficient in the use of the English language, and editorial assistants cleaned up the grammar and the syntax and the spelling, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you have the correct view of inspiration. As long as you know that these writings were not dictated, because if they were dictated, then God has bad grammar and bad syntax, and He doesn't know how to spell. The problem is with your view of inspiration. But the thoughts are Ellen White's. They are not the thoughts of the editorial assistants. Are you with me? Now, let's continue here. W.C. White, the son of Mrs. Ellen G. White, who was very active during her ministry, had this to say: Mother has never laid claim to verbal inspiration, and I do not find that my father or Elder Bates, Andrews, Smith, or Wagoner put forth this claim. If there were verbal inspiration in writing her manuscripts, why should there be, on her part, the work of addition or adaptation? Why would there be editors? Why would she add? Why, for example, to spiritual gifts, why would she expand that to 5 volumes? Why would she cross off words and put other words there? Why would certain words be added to the text if the text was being dictated to her? The General Conference in 1883 defined what inspiration is. At the top of page 9, we believe the light given by God to His servants is by the enlightenment of the mind, thus imparting the what? The thoughts, and not, except in rare cases, the very words in which the ideas should be expressed. Ellen White herself explained in Review and Herald, October 8, 1867, although I am as dependent upon the Spirit of the Lord in writing my views as I am in receiving them, yet the words I employ in describing what I have seen are what? Are my own, unless they be those spoken to me by an angel, which I always enclose in marks of quotation. So her words were her own. What is inspired is the prophet. The message is presented in human language, but it is God's divine message in human language. In other words, we believe in thought inspiration. God does not dictate the message. So the style of the language is irrelevant when it comes to inspiration. God does not dictate the message. He does not take over the pen of the prophet. The prophet is not God's calligrapher. In inspiration, there is a divine and a human element. God imbues the prophet with thoughts, and then the prophet expresses God's thoughts in human words according to his or her literary capacities. What is said about the Bible, if you're uncomfortable with this, you're not going to like Christ. What is said about the Bible can also be said about Jesus. He was the message of God, but in human flesh. The manna was heavenly food, but adapted to the needs of human beings. If God had dictated the Bible in His language, we would have been lost, because His thoughts are way above our thoughts. We have the divine treasure in human vessels. You say, well, we wish God would have spoken in His language. You wouldn't be able to understand what God is saying. So God condescends. God says, I'm going to give them some help. God, it's amazing how God, the humility of God, in speaking His message to the prophet in the language, the imperfect language of the prophet. So don't look at the language. The language that Ellen White used is irrelevant. If it was flowery, beautiful language, or if it was deficient language, is irrelevant. What is relevant is what? The message that is conveyed by the language. So this idea that, Adventists have believed that the beautiful language of Ellen White is an indication that, these things were dictated to her, as he says, it's irrelevant. Simply not true. Ellen White had this to say: God has been pleased to communicate His truth to the world by human agencies. And He Himself, by His Holy Spirit, qualified men and enabled them to do this work. He guided the mind in the selection of what to speak and what to write. The treasure was entrusted to earthen vessels, yet it is nonetheless from heaven. The testimony is conveyed through the imperfect expression of human language, yet it is the testimony of God. And the obedient, believing child of God beholds in it the glory of a divine power full of grace and truth. Ellen White never claimed that the beautiful language of her books was an evidence of her inspiration. Neither did she claim to be a William Shakespeare. She openly admitted her literary limitations, but she was always seeking to improve her literary capacities. This idea that she was the same at the end of her life as at the beginning is simply false. She became a very good writer towards the end of her life. Still, some mistakes needed to be corrected, but she was a much more proficient writer at the end of her life. That can be proved by reading her manuscripts. Just go to the White Estate, ask for her manuscripts, and read them. It's simply not true. The author of the article seems to think that only those who have been trained in literary institutions are able to write. If church members have claimed that her beautiful language is proof of her inspiration, that is not her fault. Ellen White did not attempt to hide that she was limited in her language skills. She was open and honest about it. She was absolutely transparent on this point. Here are some of many examples. In her diary for January 10, 1873, she wrote, "This morning, I take into candid consideration my writings. My husband is too feeble to help me prepare them for the printer. Therefore, I shall do no more with them at present. I am not a scholar. I cannot prepare my own writings for the press. Until I can do this, I shall write no more. It is not my duty to tax others with my manuscript." Here's another one. Diary, January 11, 1873. Very next day. "We rested well last night. This Sabbath morning opens cloudy. My mind is coming to strange conclusions. I am thinking I must lay aside my writing I have taken so much pleasure in and see if I cannot become a scholar. I am not a grammarian. I will try if the Lord will help me at 45 years old." By the way, she lived to be 87. So there were still over 40 years to grow in her ability to write. So once again, I'm not a grammarian. I will try if the Lord will help me at 45 years old to become a scholar in the science. God will help me. I believe He will. Amen. You know, one of the great secrets of being a good writer is being a good reader. And Ellen White was a prolific reader. You can tell by the number of volumes in her library. Notice this statement. Letter 67, 1894. "Now I must leave this subject so imperfectly presented that I fear you will misinterpret that which I feel so anxious to make plain. Oh, that God would quicken the understanding, for I am but a poor writer, and cannot with pen or voice express the great and deep mysteries of God. Oh, pray for yourselves, pray for me." There's a voice of humility. The author suggests that Ellen White had non-existent language skills. That's a pretty tall statement, and it's really a false witness. and that for this reason the works were the products of her editorial assistants. In his own words, it was not Ellen White who wrote these documents and prepared them for the press, but the qualified editorial assistants who worked for her in the publication business but never received due credit for their work. Now let's pursue that. This is a lame argument. When you realize that a shadow writer does not get the credit for the work, but rather the person who gave the original thoughts does. Even today on television programs, the news anchor is up front, while the copy editors merely have their names in the credits at the end of the program. Ellen White's editorial assistants were not totally ignored, by the way, because we know the names of all of them. Furthermore, why should they get the credit when they were paid for their services to be the editors? It is the employer that should get the credit, not the employees. Peter and John are described as idiots and without grammar. That's my own translation. Agrammatoi and idiotes in Acts chapter 4 and verse 13. They were fishermen with little formal education. And yet John wrote, as did Peter. Did they retain editorial assistants? Or did they apply themselves to develop their language skills? You know, John wrote towards the end of his life. So were the two epistles of Peter. Evidently, they learned to write. Ellen White emphasizes, here's another factor, that when at Pentecost they received the gift of tongues, they spoke the language correctly. Notice they spoke correctly. Don't underestimate the ability of the Holy Spirit to qualify someone to write even when they have no formal education. It's arrogant to say that someone that doesn't have formal education, a PhD, is not able to develop language skills and write. It's intellectual arrogance. Notice Acts of the Apostles, page 39 and 40. God therefore, speaking about Pentecost, God therefore in a miraculous manner supplied the deficiency of the apostles. You know what this individual is saying? He's saying that God was not sufficiently able to help Ellen White. He's underestimating the ability of God to help the prophet. She continues saying, the Holy Spirit did for them that which they could not have accomplished for themselves in a lifetime. They could now proclaim the truths of the gospel abroad, speaking with accuracy the language, notice it's saying speaking, the languages of those for whom they were laboring. This miraculous gift was a strong evidence to the world that their commission bore the signet of heaven. From this time forth, the language of the disciples was pure, simple, and accurate, whether they spoke in their native tongue or in a foreign language. It bears noting, folks, that the Greek of Peter's epistles and the Greek of the book of Revelation is very rough around the edges, in contrast to the Greek of Romans, Hebrews, and Luke. Paul and Luke were very highly educated, whereas Peter and John were not. Now let's talk about Ellen White's management of the language. Let's talk about her as a speaker. Many people had the privilege of hearing Ellen White speak during her lifetime. Notice what a secular newspaper reporter had to say about a presentation that Ellen White made at Battle Creek. Here is what a secular person wrote about Ellen White's ability to speak. Was she some ignoramus who didn't know how to put together two sentences when she spoke? Listen carefully. This is a presentation that Ellen White made at Battle Creek Tabernacle. There was a good attendance, including a large number of our most prominent people. At the lecture of Mrs. Ellen G. White at the Tabernacle last evening, this was put in the newspaper the following day. This lady gave her audience a most eloquent discourse. So which editor was whispering in her ear? Which was listened to with marked interest and attention. Her talk was interspersed with instructive facts which she had gathered in her recent visit to foreign lands, and demonstrated that this gifted lady has, in addition to her many other rare qualifications, a great faculty for attentive, careful observation and a remarkable memory of details. Now you understand why when she read the works of other authors, some of the expressions stuck to her brain. She wasn't taking out the book and copying. She was simply remembering what she had read. He continues saying, this, together with her fine delivery and her faculty of clothing her ideas with obtuse, illiterate, no, that's not what it says, with choice, beautiful, and appropriate language. Did she know how to handle the English language? Absolutely. Yes, she did. Made her lecture one of the best that has ever been delivered by any lady in our city. That she may soon favor our community with another address is the earnest wish of all who attended last evening. And should she do so, there will be a large attendance. Does that sound like what is described in this article? Please. I mean, be honest about it. At times, some have asserted that the beauty, force, and power of Ellen White's writings are due to her editorial assistants. But who were the editorial assistants who interposed between her and her audiences? No literary assistant stood by her side, polishing up her grammar, correcting her details, as she used choice, beautiful, and appropriate language. This gifted lady, with a remarkable memory of details, demonstrated, as is true for many other public persons, that speaking skills are often different from one's writing techniques. Is that true? I find it extremely difficult to write, but I have no problem speaking. You know, I sit down to write a book. It takes a long time. It's laborious. It's hard because you have to put all of your thoughts together. Ellen White didn't have that time. The thoughts just flowed to her mind, and she just wrote. She didn't take the time to do all of the editorial work because she knew that she had professionals who could clean up the grammar and the syntax. Why should she waste her time when there were people that were more capable in writing than she was? This gifted lady with a remarkable memory of details demonstrated, as is true for many other public persons, that speaking skills are often different from one's writing techniques. Writing habits often reveal the author's mind is racing faster than the pen can write. You know, sometimes I scribble things that I can't even read afterwards. Some of my best thoughts, some of my best theological thoughts come while I'm riding my bicycle in the morning. You know what I do when I get home? I scribble them on a piece of paper, lest I forget. And many times I go back to the piece of paper and have to struggle to understand what I wrote. Writing habits often reveal the author's mind is racing faster than the pen can write. Regardless, the author knows that the end product is what really matters, not the hasty techniques the author uses to get thought on paper. Clifton Taylor, a longtime Bible teacher, reflected on an occasion when he heard Ellen White for the first time. This is an eyewitness. All my life, I had heard of this woman and had wished to hear and see for myself. I had heard her critics declare that her writings were largely the work of her secretaries. Now, I observed that in her extemporaneous speech, that means that she didn't prepare for it, her statements were filled with expression exactly like those I had read so many times in her writings. As she related her various experiences, she impressed me as one who was glad to share with others the richness and blessing she had received. So what about the editorial assistants? We know now that, the beautiful language is not the test of inspiration or of the gift of prophecy. We know why Ellen White did not always use the most precise and exact language. Let's talk a little bit about her copy editors. Regarding Ellen White's use of research assistants and copy editors, the author seems to ignore that sports figures that have a very limited knowledge of English writing skills have written best-selling books. And I'd like to mention one specifically. There was a football player by the name of Dexter Manley who played for the Washington Redskins. He could not read or write, and yet a best-selling book was published by him. So how in the world could that happen? Well, let's continue reading. He was smart. The author seems to ignore that sports figures that have a very limited knowledge of English writing skills have written best-selling books. Actually, they did not write them. A shadow writer wrote the book after extensive interviews with the figure. The shadow writer is not permitted to add his own thoughts to the book. The player takes credit for the book, and the book is published under the player's name, even though professional editors do much of the editorial work. The player is given the right to read the finished product before it goes to press, to make any necessary corrections, additions, or deletions. The editor cleans up the language, but the thought content belongs to the sports figure. So why couldn't Ellen White use shadow editors? On repeated occasions, Ellen White openly admitted that she used literary assistants to perfect the language of her articles and books. But on repeated occasions, Ellen White emphasized something else. She emphasized two things. First, editorial assistants were not allowed to add their own thoughts to her productions. And second, she always read the finished product to make sure that things were as they should be. Now I'm going to read from her own writings what she actually said about her editors. And there are many here, but I thought that I would put lots of them in here so that you see that Ellen White wasn't hiding that she used editors, and she explains the reason why. She states at the top of page 13, "While my husband lived, he acted as a helper and counselor in sending out the messages that were given to me. We traveled extensively. Sometimes light would be given to me in the night season, sometimes in the daytime before large congregations. The instruction I received in vision was faithfully written out by me." By whom? With absolutely perfect grammar, syntax, and spelling, right? No. But was the message written by her? Of course it was. "The instruction I received in vision was faithfully written out by me as I had time and strength for the work. Afterward, we examined the matter together, my husband correcting what? Grammatical errors and eliminating needless repetition. Then it was carefully copied for the persons addressed or for the printer. As the work grew, others assisted me." She's really trying to hide this, isn't she? "Others assisted me in the preparation of matter for publication. After my husband's death, faithful helpers joined me, who labored untiringly in the work of copying the testimonies and preparing articles for publication. But the reports that are circulated that any of my helpers are permitted to add matter or change the meaning of the messages I write out are not true." So you have to wonder who's telling the truth here. I choose Ellen White. She continues writing, "While we were in Australia, the Lord instructed me that W.C. White should be relieved from the many burdens his brethren would lay on him, that he might be more free to assist me in the work the Lord had laid upon me. The promise had been given, I will put my Spirit upon him and give him wisdom. Since my return to America, I have several times received instruction that the Lord has given me, W.C. White, to be my helper, and that in this work the Lord will give me his Spirit. She says in Volume 3 of Selected Messages, page 90, my copyists you have seen. They do not change my language. It stands as I write it. In letter 133, 1902, she says, I read over all that is copied to see that everything is as it should be. I read all the book manuscript before it is sent to the printer, so you can see that my time must be fully occupied. Besides writing, I am called upon to speak to different churches and to attend important meetings. I could not do this work unless the Lord helped me. Probably the best known editor of Ellen White's writings was a lady by the name of Marion Davis. She actually worked for Ellen White for a period of 25 years. And I'd like to read a few statements here about her work. This statement is manuscript 146, 1904. Marion has been with me about 25 years. She was my chief worker in arranging the matter of my book. Arranging the matter of the books. Not creating, arranging. She ever appreciated the writings. Now, notice how Marion Davis considered the writings. She ever appreciated the writings as sacred matter placed in her hands, and would often relate to me what comfort and blessing she received in performing this work. That it was her health and her life to do this work. She ever handled matters placed in her hands as sacred. I shall miss her so much. Who will fill her place? Was Marion Davis angry because she was not recognized for her work? Did she recognize that it was very sacred? Did she have an issue and say, well, the words of Ellen White, they weren't inspired. I was the creator of those. Never. She continues saying, Marion's work is of a different order altogether. She is my bookmaker. And some people have misinterpreted that. See, Marion was the one who made the books. But you need to understand what Ellen White is saying. Fanny Bolton, who you'll find the explanation here, she was a newspaper writer, and after becoming a Seventh-day Adventist, was drawn into Ellen White's literary work, and soon after accompanied her to Australia. But anyway, Fanny never was my bookmaker. How are my books made? Marion does not put in her claim for recognition. So he says that recognition was not given to the editors. Marion didn't want any recognition. She wasn't the author. She was the editor. Let me ask you, is it the editor of a book that gets all of the big credit? Oh, what a wonderful book written by the editor. Of course not. The editor simply cleans up the literary production. Now notice what she continues saying. She does her work in this way. In what sense was she the bookmaker? She takes my articles that are published in the papers, that is in the Signs of the Times, Review and Herald, Youth Instructor, etc., and pastes them in blank books. She also has a copy of all the letters I write. In preparing a chapter for a book, Marion remembers that I have written something on that special point which may make the matter more forcible. She begins to search for this, and if, when she finds it, she sees that it will make the chapter more clear, she adds it. Are you understanding how she worked? And then she goes on to say, the books are not Marion's productions, but my own, gathered from all my writings. Marion has a large field from which to draw, but that large field was written by Ellen White. And her ability to arrange the matter is of great value to me. It saves my poring over a mass of matter which I have no time to do. And she also asked some of her consultants, you know, she would tell them, you know, I saw this in vision, see if you can find something relating to that. You know, writers have research assistants. It's not such a big issue. W.C. White explained about Ellen White's editorial assistants. This will be the last quotation before our break. Mother's copyists are entrusted with the work of correcting grammatical errors, of eliminating unnecessary repetitions, and of grouping paragraphs and sections in their best order. Mother's workers of experience, such as Sisters Davis, Burnham, Bolton, Peck, and Hare, who are very familiar with her writings, are authorized to take a sentence, paragraph, or section from one manuscript and incorporate it with another manuscript where the same thought was expressed but not so clearly. But none of Mother's workers are authorized to add to the manuscripts by introducing thoughts of their own. And let me just add this one more before we reach an end of this session. The books are not Marion's productions. We already had this quotation. Once again, the books are not Marion's productions, but my own, gathered from all my writings. Marion has a large field from which to draw. Why? Because Ellen White wrote over 4,500 pages of articles in Signs of the Times, Review and Herald, Youth Instructor, and other journals. She had a vast mass of material from which she could draw. She finishes by saying, "It saves my poring over a mass of matter which I have no time to do." So what do you think? That because Ellen White was a prophet, she had to spend all of her time putting all of the material that had previously been written in book form, or she had to write it out all over again from scratch? Come on, be real, folks. Ellen White was a very busy person. She was active day and night. At night, she was writing many times before anybody got up, hours before anybody got up. So she was a practical person. Once again, what this author says about Ellen White simply does not present the full picture. Ellen White was the author or was the writer of these books. The author was the Holy Spirit, not her assistants.
Visit secretsunsealed.org for annual class dates and topics. Anchor is a seminary-level course of study on the fundamentals of Seventh-day Adventist theology taught by Pastor Stephen Bohr and guest theologians. Seating is limited.